In a Chicago suburb where the streets were winding and strewn with fallen autumn leaves, their house was a clean-lined modern house of glass and concrete that had always struck Michael Bennett as the perfect frame for their life. As polished and immaculate as the glossy interior design magazines Claire loved to peruse in the evenings, sipping a glass of wine and commenting on each page with the kind of irony that made her irresistible. They had moved here 5 years ago after Claire had gotten a promotion at her marketing firm, and the house had become a symbol of their success, a spacious kitchen with a marble island where Michael could spend hours experimenting with new recipes while she worked on her laptop, and a cozy living room overlooking the garden where they would host barbecues for friends on weekends, laughing at jokes that seemed spontaneous but were actually rehearsed by a life of small joys and big plans. Michael, a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer, loved the stability. He could work from home in his second-floor studio, where light poured in through the huge windows, creating logos for startups that dreamed of changing the world, while Claire, a year younger, was racing through the ranks like a comet, leaving a trail of successful campaigns and envious glances from colleagues in her wake. The morning of the day when it all began with a slight, almost imperceptible crack in their perfect picture was typical. The sun was shining through the blinds, painting the bedroom in soft colors, and Michael was the first to wake up, as always, feeling the warmth of Claire's body next to him, her breathing even and calm, as if she were sleeping in a world where doubts did not exist. He turned to her, looking at her familiar features, the dark hair spread out on the pillow, the full lips that so easily formed a smile that could light up the room, and those little wrinkles at the corners of her eyes that appeared only when she really laughed, from the heart, like back when they first met at that office party downtown where she dropped a glass of champagne and he caught it in mid-air, and it became their first joke, their first "we." "Good morning, beautiful," he whispered, running his finger down her cheek, and she opened her eyes, green as a forest after rain, and smiled that smile that still made his heart skip a beat. Morning already? I think I just fell asleep," Claire murmured, stretching under the covers, her voice husky with sleep, but full of the same energy that always made her the center of attention wherever she went. She sat up, pushing her hair back and reaching for her phone on the nightstand, checking her messages, a habit that sometimes irritated Michael, but he'd long since come to terms with, knowing that her job required constant attention, like a spoiled child who couldn't be left unattended. "The trip to New York next week is going to be epic, Mike. New client, huge budget, and I'm leading the presentation. Imagine if it all comes together, it could be a breakthrough for the whole team." Her eyes lit up, and she began to detail the marketing strategy for this fashion brand, the meetings in Manhattan, how she planned to win over the room with her charisma, and Michael listened, nodding, feeling the usual mixture of pride and a little worry that he always brushed away like a pesky fly, because who was he to doubt her or them? He stood up, threw on his robe, and went down to the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee was already filling the air. He always made it for her, with 2 spoons of sugar and a splash of milk, just the way she liked it, and it was one of those little rituals that cemented their marriage, making it stronger than words or promises. While the coffee was brewing, Michael looked out the window at the neighboring houses, equally well kept, with lawns mown to a straight line, and thought about how their life had turned out. They had met 10 years ago, married 3, and everything had been on the rise since then. Claire's career had taken off. His freelance work was bringing in a steady income, allowing him to work on projects he enjoyed, and they had even begun to discuss children, although for now it was in the fog of the future, once she had secured her new position. But these business trips, they became more frequent, once a month, sometimes more, and although Claire always called in the evenings, sending photos from hotels and restaurants, telling him about meetings and ideas, Michael sometimes caught himself thinking that there was something new in her voice, some spark that he couldn't explain, and it made him toss and turn at night, staring at the ceiling and convincing himself that this was just paranoia born of too calm a life. "Hey, dreamer, is your coffee ready?" Claire called from above, and he smiled, pouring a cup and walking back up to where she was already seated at the vanity, applying her makeup with the precision that made her look flawless, not too much, but enough to highlight her natural beauty. "Yes, here's your pick-me-up," he said, setting the cup down and kissing the top of her head, smelling the scent of her shampoo mixed with the aroma of the coffee. They talked about their plans for the day. Her to the office for a meeting with her team, him at his computer to finalize a logo for a client in California, and the evening a dinner party with friends they'd planned a week ago to celebrate her upcoming trip. "It'll be fun," Claire said, standing and hugging him, her arms tight around his back. "Sarah and Jake are coming, and Emma and Tom, I guess. I'll make that avocado salad everyone likes." Michael nodded, but deep down he felt a little twinge. These dinners were always her thing, where she'd shine, telling stories from work, and he'd sit quietly, smiling and proud, but sometimes feeling like a shadow in her light. The day went on as usual. Michael was working in the studio, indie rock playing on the speakers to help him focus, sketching, playing around with colors and shapes until he found the perfect fit, which always left him feeling satisfied, like a puzzle coming together. Claire would call at lunch, her voice excited. "Everything is going according to plan, Mike. This project is the bomb. I can't wait to tell you the details tonight." He smiled into the phone, but when he hung up, he stared at the screen, where his design suddenly seemed bland compared to her fast-paced life. By evening, the house was filled with aromas. Claire had come home early, put on her favorite black dress that emphasized her figure, and started cooking, humming along to the radio, while Michael was setting the table in the living room, arranging glasses and candles so that everything would look perfect, like those Instagram posts she loved to like. The friends arrived promptly at 7. Sarah and Jake, a couple from Claire's college, she a teacher, he an engineer, always ready with jokes, and Emma and Tom, the neighbors, she a fitness trainer, he an accountant, with their eternal story about renovating their house. "Wow, Claire, you look amazing," Sarah exclaimed, hugging her at the door. "This business trip to New York, you're going to be the queen of Manhattan." They sat around the table, the wine flowed, and the conversation flowed as easily as ever. About work, about holiday plans, about how Jake was trying to learn to play the guitar, but was only able to produce something like a cat concerto, as he joked, causing everyone to laugh. Claire, as usual, was in the center, talking about her project with such enthusiasm that everyone was listening, her hands gesturing, her eyes shining, and Michael sitting opposite, looking at her with quiet pride, thinking how lucky he was that she had chosen him out of all the others. Imagine this. We're launching an influencer campaign that could go viral if it works. New York is a place where ideas are born and die overnight, but I feel like we can do it, Claire said, and everyone nodded impressed. Tom raised his glass. To Claire, our star. "Michael, you're lucky to have a wife like you, who's not only smart, but also beautiful, and always on the go. Aren't you afraid she'll find someone more interesting on those business trips?" It was said jokingly, with a wink, but the words hung in the air like candle smoke, and everyone laughed except Michael, who smiled, but felt something inside him tighten, a slight, almost imperceptible, but real doubt, like a crack in glass that's not visible yet, but could grow over time. "Oh, Tom, there you go with your usual business trip romance jokes," Emma said, elbowing him, but Claire laughed the loudest, putting her hand on Michael's shoulder. "Mike knows I always come back to him. He's my anchor in this crazy world." Michael squeezed her hand, nodding. "Of course I know. The house is empty without you." But inside, Tom's words echoed, business trip romances. He remembered how the last time she'd been in LA, her calls had gotten shorter, and one text had included the name of a colleague, Alex, with whom she'd had a great evening discussing strategy, and even though she'd explained it was the group, doubt had crept in like a shadow on a sunny day. Dinner went on. The avocado salad was a success, the steaks Michael grilled were juicy, and dessert, a cheesecake from a nearby bakery, was a delight. They talked about movies, about politics, about Sarah planning a trip to Europe, and Claire shared tips for New York. "You should definitely go to Central Park in the fall, it's magical." Michael joined in the conversation, cracking jokes when necessary, but his mind was spinning around that remark, and he found himself looking at Claire a little harder, looking for signs of something hidden, but she was the same as always, open, loving, with that smile that lit up the room. When their friends left, it was past midnight, and they cleared the dishes together, the only sounds of their friends' glasses clinking and the soft music playing on the loudspeaker. "It was a nice night, wasn't it?" Claire said, hugging him from behind as he washed the glasses. "Tom's a joker, but you know that's nothing." Michael turned, drying his hands. "Yeah, I know. It's just, these trips, they're a lot. I'm proud of you, but sometimes I miss you." She kissed him, long and tenderly. "I miss you too. But this is for us, for our future. I promise I'll come back with lots of stories and a gift for you." They went to bed, cuddling under the covers, and Michael fell asleep telling himself everything was okay. But deep down there was that crack, a hint that their perfect facade might be hiding more than he was willing to admit. The next morning, Claire began packing for the business trip, her suitcase open on the bed as she carefully folded dresses, blouses, shoes, listing, "This is for the presentation, this is for dinner with a client, and this is for emergencies." Michael helped, handing them over, but his mind was wandering. He pictured her in New York, in the bright lights of the city, meeting people full of ambition, and that Alex flashed through his mind again, the colleague she had mentioned in passing, but with warmth. "Tell me about this Alex," he asked suddenly, trying to sound casual, and Claire looked up, surprised. "Alex, he's on our team, a hotshot analyst. Why do you ask?" "Just because you mentioned him last time." She smiled. "Yeah, he's a smart guy, helps with the data, but nothing special." Michael nodded, but the doubt remained. The days before they left passed in a routine. Work, evenings together, walks in the park where they held hands, discussing small things, and Michael tried to enjoy himself, but a slight tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. The night before they left, they had dinner at their favorite restaurant, Italian, pasta and wine, and Claire was especially tender, kissing him across the table. "Love you, Mike. It's only a week." He replied, "Love you more. Be careful out there." But when they got home and she fell asleep, he couldn't sleep a wink, looking at her sleeping face and wondering if Tom was right, and there was room for something else on these business trips. In the morning, he drove her to the airport. The kiss goodbye was long, and she left waving, her silhouette disappearing into the crowd. The house seemed empty when he returned, and Michael sat down at his computer, but instead of working, he opened her social media just to look at photos, but saw a notification of a new message from someone he didn't know. No, it was a mistake, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away, but he knew that this week would be long, full of questions he didn't want answers to. Their perfect life, so polished on the outside, suddenly seemed fragile, like a glass ball ready to shatter at the slightest push, and Michael felt the tension building, quietly but inexorably, hinting that there was something lurking beneath the surface that could change everything. O'Hare International Airport was a hive of activity, full of voices all mingling in a chaotic symphony. Flight announcements, the creaking of suitcase wheels, snatches of conversation in a dozen languages, and, somewhere in the distance, the cry of a child demanding attention. Michael stood next to Claire at the check-in counter, her suitcase already disappearing into the depths of the baggage conveyor, and she, as always, looked collected, but with a slight spark of impatience in her eyes, as if she were already mentally in New York, in the thick of meetings and negotiations. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her black blazer fit perfectly, and on her wrist glittered the thin gold watch Michael had given her for their 5th anniversary, which she now wore almost always like a talisman. He looked at her, trying to capture this moment, her confident smile, her scent, a new perfume, by the way, something with notes of sandalwood and jasmine, which she started using a couple of months ago, and which he noticed but didn't comment on, because, well, it's just perfume, right? "Okay, flight leaves in an hour," Claire said, checking her phone, her fingers quickly sliding across the screen as she responded to a message. "I'll call you as soon as I land, okay? And don't forget to water the orchids. They're on their last legs." She smiled, but her eyes were distant, as if she was already running through her mental to-do list in Manhattan. Michael nodded, feeling something tighten in his chest, not pain, not resentment, but something elusive, like the slight chill that runs across your skin before it rains. "The orchids are fine, don't worry. You just..." "Be careful out there, okay?" he said, his voice a little quieter than he'd intended, but Claire didn't seem to notice because she immediately hugged him, tightly but quickly, as if she were in a hurry. "Love you, Mike. The week will fly by before you know it." She kissed him on the lips, her lipstick leaving a light mark that he automatically wiped off as she turned to go through security. He watched her silhouette disappear into the crowd, her black blazer, her easy stride, her suitcase on wheels, which she rolled with the confidence that always made her seem invincible to him. Michael stood there for a minute longer, as if hoping she would turn around, wave again, but she didn't, and he turned toward the exit, feeling like the airport had suddenly become too big, too noisy, and too small in the chaos. In the car on the way home, the radio was playing an old Coldplay hit, and he found himself thinking about her new perfume instead of listening. When had she started using it? It must have been after that trip to Los Angeles 3 months ago, when she'd come back with sparkling eyes, talking about a new project, but for some reason she'd kept quiet about where she'd been on a Friday night, when her phone had been out of range until midnight. "I'm just tired, turned off the sound," she said then, and he believed her because he wanted to believe, because their life was perfect, and why look for cracks where there didn't seem to be any? The house greeted him with a silence so thick it almost rang in his ears. Michael dropped his keys on the table by the door, walked into the kitchen, and put on the kettle automatically just to keep his hands occupied. He was trying to focus on work. He had a deadline for a logo for a startup that promised to revolutionize food delivery, but his mind was wandering. He remembered small details that had previously seemed insignificant. The way Claire had started staying late at the office more often before traveling, the way her answers about her schedule had become shorter, more evasive. "Oh, just meetings, you know how it is," she would say when he asked who she was having dinner with or why she was home later than usual. And Alex, the analyst she'd mentioned the day before, Michael suddenly realized he didn't know what he looked like, or how old he was, or why his name kept coming up in her stories. He opened his laptop to distract himself, but instead found himself on her LinkedIn page, scrolling through her colleagues, trying to guess which one might be Alex. "Bullshit," he muttered, closing the tab, but the feeling of unease remained, like the taste of bitter coffee he'd forgotten to finish. To shake things out, he decided to unpack the bedroom. Claire always left a little mess before she left, and he liked to tidy up, as if it helped organize his thoughts too. Her bag, the one she'd taken on her last trip, was lying carelessly tossed in the corner of the closet, and Michael reached for it to put it on the shelf. The bag was open, and when he picked it up, something fell out, a small, crumpled piece of paper that landed on the floor like an autumn leaf. He leaned over and picked it up, a receipt from a cocktail bar in Los Angeles, dated that same Friday when her phone had been out of range. It listed 2 drinks, a margarita and an old-fashioned, and the amount was paid in cash, no name on it. Michael paused, holding the receipt in his hands, his fingers shaking slightly as he reread the date and time. 11:47 p.m., he remembered her words. Just tired, went to bed early. But the receipt spoke of something else, of an evening at a bar, of someone she had been drinking with, of something she hadn't told him. He sat on the edge of the bed, the receipt still in his hand, and his mind was split in two. One part, the rational one, was telling him it didn't matter. Maybe she was with colleagues, maybe it was a client, maybe she'd just forgotten to mention it. But the other part, the one that woke at night and whispered doubts, was painting pictures of Claire laughing at a table at the bar, her hand brushing against someone else's, her eyes bright with wine and conversation, and that someone wasn't him. He shoved the receipt into the pocket of his jeans, not knowing what to do with it, but feeling that throwing it away would be admitting he was afraid of the truth. Michael stood up, walked into the studio, and tried to work, but every time his hand reached for the mouse, he thought of the receipt, of her new perfume, of her evasive answers, of how easily she'd walked away at the airport without looking back. That evening, Claire called, her voice bright and energetic. "Mike, I've landed. The hotel is gorgeous. The view of the city is out of this world. Big meeting tomorrow. I'm a little nervous, but it's awesome." He listened, trying to sound like his usual self, but his "good for you, honey" sounded a little strained, and he hoped she wouldn't notice. "How are you? Are you missing me too much?" she asked, and he almost answered honestly, but instead said, "I'm fine, just working, watering the orchids." She laughed, and her laugh was so familiar, so dear, that for a second he felt stupid for suspecting her. But when she hung up, promising to call tomorrow, he pulled the check out of his pocket and stared at it again, like it was a riddle he couldn't solve. He barely slept that night, tossing and turning in his too big bed, her pillows still smelling of that new perfume. He imagined her in New York, in the bright lights of restaurants, surrounded by people who might see her as more than just a marketing executive, but a woman who shone like a star. Michael knew he should stop overthinking, but the receipt sat on his nightstand like a silent witness, and his mind couldn't find peace. He got up, poured himself a whiskey, a rare treat for him, and sat by the window, looking out over the dark garden, where their perfect life now seemed as distant as a mirage. Something had changed, and he didn't know if it was his paranoia or reality, but one thing was clear. This week without her would not just be long, it would be excruciating, full of questions he was afraid to ask and answers he didn't want to hear. Michael's home office, a small second-floor room overlooking a quiet street in suburban Chicago, where the trees were already starting to shed their leaves in anticipation of true fall, had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in pixels and vectors, creating designs that felt almost alive to him, as if each logo carried a piece of his soul. But today, on this gray Tuesday, with Claire a day away from New York, the office felt like a cage, full of echoes of his own thoughts, circling like crows over a field, swooping down with the sharp beak of doubt, then soaring upward in an attempt to rationalize everything that had accumulated over the past few days. He was sitting at his big monitor, where an open project, the logo for that food delivery startup, was blinking its cursor at him, inviting him to work, but his fingers were frozen on the keyboard and his eyes were wandering around the screen, unfocused, because his mind was playing over and over again with that cocktail bar receipt he'd hidden in his desk drawer, as if the problem didn't exist if he couldn't see it. But damn it, it did, and it was like an itch under his skin that he couldn't scratch without making it bleed. Michael leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight, and stared out the window at the neighbor's dog barking at a passing bicycle, and thought about how simple everything was for animals, no business trips, no secrets, just instincts and daily routine, while his life, so stable at first, suddenly began to crack at the seams, and he didn't even know when it had started, maybe with Tom's joke at dinner, or earlier, when Claire first returned from a trip with that new gleam in her eyes that he had attributed to a successful deal, but now wondered if it was just the adrenaline of work or something more personal, more dangerous. He reached for his phone to check his messages. Claire had written him a short one this morning. "Good morning, love. Busy as hell. Meeting in half an hour. Love," and he replied with a heart emoji, but inside he felt a prick, because before her messages were longer, full of details, as if she was sharing pieces of her day, and now they seemed like a formal reply, as if she was rushing somewhere, to someone, and this thought, so absurd at first glance, haunted him, forcing him to reread old chats, to look for changes in tone, in emoji, in the way she signed off before, "Your Claire," and now just "loves." Michael stood up and paced the room, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the wooden floor, and he thought he needed to go out to unwind, because sitting here in this silence was unbearable, as if the walls were whispering all his fears to him, and he grabbed his jacket and keys and headed to the local coffee shop, the one on the corner, with cozy tables by the window and the aroma of freshly baked goods, where he and Claire sometimes had breakfast on weekends, chatting about their plans for the day, and where he now hoped to find at least some distraction from the whirlwind in his head. The coffee shop was half empty, a couple of college students on their laptops, an older woman reading a book, and Ryan Carter, his best friend since college, who was sitting at a corner table with a latte and his phone in his hands, scrolling through social media with that lazy smile that always made him look like a guy who didn't have a care in the world, even though Michael knew that Ryan, with his job at an IT company and a recent divorce, had been through a lot, but he was able to hide it behind jokes and sarcasm like a shield. They had been friends for 15 years, since they shared a dorm room where they spent the nights arguing about movies and girls, And Ryan was the person Michael always went to for advice because he told the truth to your face without sugarcoating it, but with a bit of humor that softened the blow. "Hey, Mike, old man," Ryan called out as he saw him in the doorway, waving him over to sit down. "You look like you haven't slept in a week. What, Claire's on the road again, and you're hanging around here alone like a ghost in a castle?" Michael smiled as he sat down across from him and ordered an Americano from a passing waitress, who gave him a familiar smile like a regular customer. But even that smile didn't lift his spirits today. "Yeah, she's in New York for a week," Michael said, stirring sugar into his coffee when it arrived, his voice quieter than he'd intended, a hint of weariness that Ryan caught immediately because he raised an eyebrow and put his phone down. "It's fine, it's just, work isn't going well, my mind is wandering." Ryan leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his dark hair as tousled as ever, his eyes amused but also curious. "Wandering, you say? That sounds like code for I'm in some kind of trouble. Tell me, brother, what's been eating at you? Is it about that joke at dinner? Tom, that idiot, always says something inappropriate." Michael nodded, looking into his cup where the coffee was swirling like his thoughts, and decided he needed to talk, because holding it all in was like carrying a rock in his pocket, getting heavier with every step. "Not only that, I found a receipt in her bag from her last trip yesterday, 2 drinks at a bar late at night when she said she went to bed early, and this new perfume, and her answers have become evasive. I don't know, Ryan, maybe I'm being paranoid, but something feels off." Ryan whistled softly, leaning forward, his face serious, but with that spark of humor that never left him even in difficult moments. "Wow, Detective Bennett is on the warpath. Look, a receipt is not evidence. Maybe she was with a friend or a coworker, had a drink, and forgot to tell her because it's small stuff. But if it's eating you up, talk to her directly when she gets back. Otherwise, you'll sit there and get worked up like I did with my ex. Remember how I checked her phone and found nothing but salad recipes?" Michael nodded, but something inside him was bothering him, and he continued, lowering his voice, although no one in the coffee shop was listening. "And this Alex, her colleague, she mentions him often, with some kind of warmth. And yesterday at the airport, she didn't even turn around when she left. You know, Ryan, sometimes it seems like she leads a double life here with me, calm, and there, on trips, another Claire, free, without obligations." Ryan laughed, but not offensively, but so as to diffuse the atmosphere, and patted him on the shoulder. "A double life? Oh, dude, you've been reading too many thrillers. Maybe she's a CIA spy, and her business trips are a cover for missions in New York, where she seduces millionaires for information. Or, more simply, she just enjoys her work, and you sit here and invent drama. But seriously, if you're worried, check social networks. Maybe there's nothing suspicious there, and you'll calm down." They talked about other small things about Ryan's work, where he was fighting a bug in the system that was eating up time like a Pac-Man monster, and about plans for the weekend, where Michael lied that everything was fine, but Ryan's words about social media stuck in his head like a hook. And when he got home, the office greeted him with silence again, but now with a slight impulse of action. Michael sat down at his computer, opened his browser, and went to Claire's Instagram profile. They followed each other, but he rarely scrolled through her feed, trusting that everything was open. But today his fingers tugged at the search bar, and he typed in her name to see if there was anything new. And suddenly he came across a tagged photo from a coworker he didn't know, a post from 3 weeks ago, from a company event in Chicago, where Claire was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling, and a man he didn't know was standing next to her, tall, with a charming smile, his hand on her shoulder, light but intimate, and the caption that said, "Great night with the team. Claire, you're a star. Hash work fun, hash team spirit," and the hashtags and likes from other coworkers, including Alex, whose profile was linked. Michael stared at the photo, his heart pounding like a drum in the silent room, and he zoomed in, taking in the details. The man was handsome, in a suit, with the confidence that spoke of success, and Claire looked happy, genuinely happy, not the tired smile she sometimes had at home after a long day, but full of life, and the thought hit him like a cold shower. When was the last time she laughed like that with him? He scrolled through the comments, nothing suspicious, just awesome. You're awesome. But one from Alex. Claire, you made this evening unforgettable, with a winking emoji, and that seemed too playful, too personal to Michael, and he closed the tab. But the photo remained in his head like an imprint, and his thoughts raced. Who is this guy? Why didn't she tell him about the event? Maybe it was nothing, just a photo from work. But why the hand on the shoulder? Why the laughter? He stood up and paced the room, trying to push away his suspicions, telling himself that he was paranoid, that Ryan was right, and they needed to talk. But the fear was stronger, the fear that if he asked, everything would fall apart and their perfect life would turn out to be an illusion. That evening, Claire video called him, her face tired but happy, the hotel room overlooking the city lights behind her, and she was describing the meeting. Mike, that was epic. The client loved it, and we closed $1 million deal. Dinner with the team tomorrow, but I'll go to bed early, I promise. He smiled, but his awesome, I'm proud of you sounded fake even to him, and she said, Are you okay? You look tired. Yeah, just work, he lied, not daring to ask about the photo, the check, the man, because what if she got mad, accused him of not trusting him, and that would be the beginning of the end. They talked some more about small things. She blew him a kiss, and the screen went black, leaving him alone, his thoughts spinning out of control again, picturing each worse scenario than the next Claire at the bar with that man, their laughter, their touch, but he was still in denial, clinging to the hope that it was just a crack, not a fracture, and that when she came back everything would be back to normal. But sleep wouldn't come, and Michael lay down with his phone, opening that photo again, studying it like a detective, looking for clues that would confirm or deny his fears, and at that moment he realized that the first crack had already made itself known, and it was slowly but surely making him doubt everything he knew about his wife, about their marriage, about himself. Michael couldn't stop himself. After the call, he went back to social media, but this time deeper, clicking on the profile of the colleague who tagged the photo and saw other posts. The team at conferences, Claire in the center, always smiling, always energetic, and that man appeared in several. His name was Justin, a marketer from another department, and in one story that was saved, they were dancing at an after-party, her hand on his waist, but it could have been nothing, just fun. But for Michael, it was like oil on the fire, and he felt a burning in his chest, a jealousy that he had not known in himself before, because their relationship had always been calm, without drama. But now everything was changing. The next day, he met Ryan again, at the same coffee shop because it was unbearable at home, and told her about the photo, showing it on his phone, and Ryan frowned, but then smiled. Dude, it's a corporate party, people are chilling there. But if it bothers you, ask her, hey, who's that guy in the photo? And see how she reacts. Don't push it, or you'll go crazy. Michael nodded, but inside he knew he wouldn't ask because he was afraid of the answer, and so it went on all week, his thoughts spiraling, denial mixed with suspicion, and the crack grew. In the office, Michael tried to work, but every design felt fake, like his smile when he talked to Claire, and he remembered their moments together, a vacation in Mexico where they walked along the beach holding hands, and she whispered how she loved him. But now the memory was tinged with doubt. Was she sincere? And the photo with Justin came back, and he imagined them chatting, flirting, and it was painful. But he still denied it, telling himself that it was crazy, that Claire loved him, and the check was an accident, the perfume a change of taste, but the seed was planted, and it grew. I extend the dialogue with Ryan. Listen, Ryan, this isn't just a photo, look at his hand, her laugh. And Alex with the emoji. What if? What if she's cheating? Brother, if so, you deserve to know, but don't torture yourself with assumptions. Check her phone when she gets back, or talk to her. But remember, my divorce suspicion ruined everything, even when nothing happened. Michael left, thinking, and at home he opened a bottle of beer, sat in the dark, and his thoughts did not subside. The tension grew, but he did not confront it directly, afraid of the truth. In the Bennett house, that modern glass and concrete haven where every corner had once seemed filled with the warmth of their life together, but was now a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, where Michael wandered like a lost traveler in the fog of his own suspicions that grew thicker and more intrusive with each passing hour. Like a cobweb entangling his mind and preventing him from breathing freely, he sat in his second-floor studio, staring at his computer screen, but seeing nothing but the blurry outlines of a design that was supposed to be delivered yesterday, and instead his fingers hovered over the keyboard because his thoughts were not here, not in pixels and color palettes, but in New York, where Claire, his wife, the woman he loved more than anything in the world, spent her days in meetings and her evenings in uncertainty, and this uncertainty burned inside him like a slow-burning ember ready to burst into flames if only a little more wind blew. One doubt, and he knew he shouldn't, he knew it was going too far, but the thirst for the truth, that damn thirst that had been tormenting him since he'd found the receipt in her bag, and then seen that photo on social media of her laughing with a stranger, was pushing him forward, making him do things he would later regret. But at that moment, in that silence of the empty house, where even the clock ticked too loudly, reminding him of the passing of time, he couldn't stop, because if he didn't find out now, then when, and what if the truth turned out to be worse than he imagined, or, on the contrary, dispelled all the shadows, returning him to the peace he so desperately desired. Michael leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight as if in protest at what he was about to do, and his gaze fell on Claire's laptop, which she had left at home because a tablet will suffice for the trip, she had said before she left, kissing him goodbye with that smile that now seemed to him like a mask, hiding something, and he remembered how a couple of years ago, when they had shared passwords for convenience, "In case I forget mine, honey," she had given him access to her email, a simple combination of their wedding date and the name of their first dog, the one they had gotten in college, and it had been an act of trust, a symbol of their closeness. But now he felt like a traitor, sitting here in the dim room with the light from the window slanting, painting everything in gray tones, and his fingers, trembling slightly with adrenaline and guilt, typed in her email address, entered the password, and there it was, inbox opening like Pandora's box, full of messages from colleagues, clients, spam. But he didn't rummage through randomly. No, he was methodical. Like a detective in an old noir he watched at night when he couldn't sleep, and he started by searching for keywords: New York, meeting, Alex, but nothing suspicious, just work threads about the project. And he was almost relieved, thinking that this was paranoia, that Ryan was right and he should stop. But then he typed in personal, just at random, and there they were, the messages from Ethan Hayes, a name Claire had heard mentioned, a colleague from a partner firm. She'd said, but now these messages, dated in recent months, seemed more than just work to him, with a hint of flirtation between the lines, like a hint, not direct, but enough to sting. The first email was from 2 weeks ago, with the subject line, campaign ideas and more, and Ethan had written, "Claire, your branding suggestions are on fire, just like you were at that conference in Chicago, remember? Can't wait to discuss this in person in Nick. Maybe over dinner, without the whole team. Your enthusiasm is infectious, and I'd love to hear more about the side of you that's not in the reports. Can't wait, Ethan." And Claire had written back briefly, but with an emoji, "Sounds exciting. We'll discuss the details when we get there." And Michael had read it twice, 3 times, feeling the blood rush to his face because, that side of you, what the hell did that mean? And why hadn't she told him about that dinner? Or was it just business? But the tone, the playful tone, with a hint of something personal, had him digging deeper, scrolling through old emails where Ethan had joked about the chemistry on our team, especially between us, and Claire would say, "Ha, you're a flatterer, but yeah, there's chemistry," and it was like a punch in the gut, because he could picture them together in some dimly lit restaurant, her laughing at his jokes like in that photo, and his hand touching hers, and the image was so vivid, so painful, that he closed his eyes, trying to push it away, but the guilt of being here, in her inbox, without permission, was warring with rage and fear, leaving him torn between, "I have a right to know," and "What have I done? This is an invasion." And he felt like a monster, but he couldn't stop because the truth, whatever it was, seemed like the only salvation from this torture of ignorance now. And then he found the email that had become the key one from the day before. The subject line was, "Meeting in person tomorrow," and Ethan had written, Claire, glad the project is going smoothly. As for our meeting in person, let's do it at 8 p.m. at Bernardin. It's the perfect place for private conversations. Can't wait to see you alone without distractions. It will be unforgettable. Ethan and Claire had replied, confirmed 8 p.m. Can't wait, with a simple smiley face, but for Michael it was like a bomb going off in his head, because meeting in person, seeing you alone, meeting in person didn't sound like work. It sounded like a date, like something forbidden, and he imagined her there, in New York, in a fancy restaurant. With this Ethan he now hated even though he'd never met, and his hands clenched into fists, and his heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of his chest, and the guilt took a back seat to panic, because if it was true, if she was cheating, then their life, their marriage, everything they had spent 10 years building would collapse like a house of cards, and he didn't know if he could survive that. But at the same time, part of him whispered, maybe this is a misunderstanding, ask her, and he grabbed the phone, dialed without thinking, because if not now, then when, and the beeps seemed like an eternity until she answered, her voice cheerful, but with a slight hum in the background, like she was on the move, in a taxi, or on the streets of Manhattan, where life was in full swing 24 hours a day. Mike, hi, Claire said, and there was joy in her tone, but it was distracted, as if she were multitasking, checking her messages or looking out the window at the skyscrapers. Is something wrong? You don't usually call during the day. He swallowed, trying to sound normal, but his voice betrayed him by a tremor. No, nothing, just missing you. Tell me, how's your day? What are your plans for tonight? And a pause, slight but noticeable, as if she was choosing her words, and it stung him more than any email could. Oh, busy day, non-stop meetings. Tonight, dinner with colleagues, as usual. Nothing special. How are you, honey? Work going well? He heard the evasiveness in her voice, that slight insincerity he knew from years of living together, when she was hiding a birthday surprise or how tired she was after work. But now it seemed like a lie, a big, fat lie, and he wanted to shout, "What about Ethan? A private meeting at Bernardin?" But instead he said, "It's okay, I was just thinking about you. Be careful there." "Of course I love you," she said, and the line was cut off, leaving him in a silence where her words echoed, but did not soothe him, only increased his anxiety, because she had not mentioned details, had not said with whom, and it was like confirmation, albeit indirectly, and Michael felt the guilt return, mixing with rage at himself for spying, for not asking directly, for now knowing too much and too little at the same time. He logged out of his email, erased his browser history as if that would erase his guilt, and walked through the house, going into rooms that reminded him of her, the kitchen with her favorite mugs, the bedroom with her pillows still smelling of that new perfume that he now associated with betrayal, and he thought about his ethics, about how he had overstepped his bounds, invading her privacy, and that made him no better if she really was guilty, because trust was the foundation and he had just violated it, and the questions swirled in his head. What if the emails were innocent, just flirtations without consequences, a business charm to smooth over business rough edges, and he would ruin everything with his suspicions? But the thirst for truth did not subside, it drove him further, forcing him to imagine what was happening now in New York at 8 p.m., when she would meet Ethan, and this thought was unbearable, like torture, and he poured himself a whiskey, sat in the living room, looking at the dark garden, where the leaves rustled in the wind, and felt himself on the edge of the abyss, where one step and everything will change forever. But there was no retreat, because digging deeper opened a door that could not be closed, and now he could only wait, suffer, and think about how far he was willing to go to find out the truth, and how much this truth was worth their love. That night he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, where her side was cold and empty, and thoughts of Ethan, of the letters, of her evasive answer tormented him like demons, and he found himself checking her location on the shared app they had installed for security, and he saw that she was in a restaurant at Bernardin as it had been written, and that was confirmation. But without details was she alone or not, and guilt burned because he had become a spy in his own marriage, crossing moral boundaries that he had always considered sacred, and it raised questions about himself. Who was he now, a jealous husband, or a paranoid person destroying everything out of fear, and the purpose of this digging the truth or self-destruction. But the morning came with new doubts, and the story went on, obsessive, disturbing, like a thriller, where the hero is his own worst enemy. New York hummed outside the hotel windows like a giant orchestra, where every sound taxi horns, snatches of conversations of passers-by, the distant rumble of the subway merged into a symphony, which for Claire Bennett was always not noise, but the pulse of life, the energy that fed her ambitions, spurred her to move faster, think sharper, be one step ahead of everyone who tried to take her place in this ruthless world of marketing, where one successful presentation could open the doors to the future, and one mistake slammed them shut forever. She stood at the picture window of her 23rd floor Manhattan hotel room, where the glass facades of skyscrapers reflected the setting sun, painting everything in golden pink tones, and her reflection in the glass dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, a strict but elegant suit that emphasized her confidence seemed simultaneously familiar and alien to her, as if this woman preparing for the most important presentation of her career was not quite the same Claire who, back home in Chicago, made avocado salads and hugged Michael, whispering that she loved him more than anything in the world. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the slight tremor in her chest, not from fear, no, Claire Bennett wasn't afraid. She was born for moments like this, when everything was on the line, but from the pressure that was growing with each passing hour. Because this project, this campaign for a new client, a billion-dollar fashion brand, could be her ticket to the next level. The VP of marketing job she'd dreamed of since she'd first stepped foot in the InnovateAds office 7 years ago. And now, on the eve of a crucial meeting, she felt like an actress before a premiere, where the stage was the conference room and the audience were the people on whom her future depended. Her phone vibrated on the table, and she picked it up, expecting a message from the team or a client, but it was Michael, just 3 words. "Miss you. Is everything okay?" And her heart sank because in those words, so simple, she caught something else, a hint of distance that had been creeping into his voice these past few days, especially yesterday when he'd called in the afternoon, which was so unlike him, and his questions about her plans for the evening had sounded more than just curious, like he was trying to find a catch, and it bothered her because Michael, her Michael, had always been her anchor, the man who had supported her even when her career had taken her thousands of miles from home, and the thought of him drifting away was like a cold breeze on a warm day, barely noticeable but making her shiver. She wrote back, "Miss you too, honey. Busy as hell, but I'm okay with it. I'll call you tonight," and hit send, but as she looked at the screen, she felt the twinge of guilt she hadn't called as long as she'd promised yesterday because after the meeting, the team had dragged her to a bar to celebrate a midterm success, and she'd lost track of time, laughing at her colleagues' jokes and feeling free for a moment, not a wife, not a director, just Claire, a 30-year-old woman enjoying the moment. But now, alone in the room, she wondered if her late call had offended Michael, made him feel abandoned, and the thought was like a small pebble in her shoe, not fatal, but annoying. Claire moved away from the window, sat at her desk, where her laptop was open to the final version of the presentation 60 slides, each polished to perfection, with charts and forecasts and creative concepts that she had spent months developing, and her team, including analyst Alex and partners from another firm like Ethan Hayes, had contributed greatly, but still, it was her idea, her vision, and tomorrow, at 10 a.m., she would stand in front of a room full of skeptics in expensive suits and convince them that her plan was the future of their brand. She scrolled through the slides, checking every number, every phrase, her fingers shaking slightly from the caffeine her third cup that day, and she thought she should go to bed early. But then she remembered the dinner with Ethan at Le Bernardin that she'd confirmed in an email, and it hadn't really been a work meeting, even though it had started out that way because Ethan, with his wit and easy charisma, had suggested they discuss distraction-free strategy, and she'd agreed, thinking it was just business, but knowing deep down that his tone had been a little too warm, and it made her wonder if she'd crossed an invisible line, even though she hadn't, and she had no intention of crossing it. But she still hadn't told Michael, because why worry him when it was just dinner, just conversation, and she loved him, only him, and all of this was for the sake of their future. their dreams of a bigger house, of children, of a life where they weren't counting every penny. She got up to get ready, picked out a dress navy, formal, but with a cut that added a little femininity and applied light makeup, emphasizing the eyes that Michael always called Forrest. And looking in the mirror, she thought of him, how he was probably sitting in their house right now, in his studio, drawing logos, and it made her smile. But then a shadow his voice yesterday had been so distant, and she promised herself to call him after dinner, to tell him everything, well, almost everything, because Ethan was unimportant, just a colleague who got a little carried away, and she would cope, as she always did, balancing between work and home, between her ambitions and their marriage, which was her foundation, even if sometimes she forgot to show it. At Le Bernardin, where the lighting was soft and the tables were draped in white tablecloths like something out of a French movie, Claire sat across from Ethan Hayes, who looked as impeccable as ever, dark suit, light stubble, a smile that could sell toothpaste, and they talked about the project, the clients, how their firms could combine forces on the next campaign, and it was all professional until the wine, a glass of Pinot Noir for her. A bourbon for him made the conversation a little more relaxed, and Ethan, leaning in a little closer than necessary, said, "Claire, not only are you a marketing genius, but there's just something about you that makes these evenings special. It's not often you meet someone who lights up a room like that." His eyes lingered on her a little longer than they should have, and she felt the warmth of the wine mix with a little discomfort, because it was flirting, obvious but not aggressive, and she could have brushed it off. But instead she smiled, polite but firm, and said, "Thank you, Ethan, but I'm here for the project, and I have someone at home who lights up my life every day." She took a sip of wine to cover up the slight awkwardness, and he nodded, stepping back, but still smiling, like he didn't quite believe she'd closed the door, and it irritated her because she didn't want to play these games, didn't want to give an excuse, but she also didn't want to ruin the working relationship that was important to the project, and that fine line between professional and personal made her feel vulnerable in a way that was so out of character. The dinner was over quickly. She had insisted on splitting the bill, so there would be no innuendo, and in the cab back to the hotel, she thought about Michael, how he was probably waiting for her call, and how she hadn't mentioned Ethan because it didn't matter. It wasn't a date, just dinner, but still she felt a twinge of guilt because she knew how sensitive he was about her travel, and his distance in the last few calls had only added to that feeling, as if there was a wall growing between them that she couldn't see but could feel. In the room, she dialed his number, and he answered almost immediately, his voice tired but warm. "Hi, how are you?" And she started talking about the day, about the presentation, about New York. But she skipped dinner, saying only, "Been out with the team, tired, big day tomorrow." And his "good for you, honey" sounded like he was trying to be sincere, but was holding something back. And it pricked her because she wanted to ask if everything was okay. But she was afraid that the conversation would go in the wrong direction, and she just said, "Love you, Mike. Good night." As she lay in bed, looking out the window at the city lights, she thought that she should be more honest with him, but how to tell him about little things that didn't mean anything without making him worry, and that thought stayed with her like a shadow, adding another layer to her internal conflict between a career that demanded that she be bright, confident, open, and a marriage that asked for stability, trust, and simplicity. The next morning, before the presentation, she stood in front of the mirror, repeating the key points, her heart beating steadily, but her thoughts sometimes slipped to Michael, to his voice, to the way he looked at her at the airport, and she promised herself that after the presentation she would call him, talk longer, tell him more, to erase this detachment. But for now the room was full of expectations, and she, Claire Bennett, had to shine, even if love, duty, and ambition fought inside, creating an ambiguity that made her actions so understandable and so mysterious at the same time. In the Bennett house, where the morning light poured through the large windows, painting the living room in soft golden tones, Michael sat at the kitchen island, clutching a mug of cold coffee that he never finished because his thoughts were somewhere else. Not here, in this perfect house that he and Claire had built with such trepidation, choosing every element of the decor, from the marble countertop to the photographs on the walls of them, laughing on the beach in Mexico, or hugging in front of an autumn park, But now those memories seemed to him like the scenery for a play in which he did not know his role, because everything he thought was true was now creaking at the seams like an old wooden floor under the weight of footsteps. His eyes, red from a sleepless night, kept returning to the phone in front of him, where the location tracking app he and Claire had installed a couple of years ago, just in case, burned like a beacon promising answers, but also threatening to destroy everything he had tried so desperately to preserve. He knew it was wrong, another step beyond, after he'd already gone through her email, read those letters from Ethan Hayes that still burned him like acid, but he couldn't stop, like he couldn't stop a car going downhill, and his fingers, shaking with a mixture of guilt and determination, opened the app, and there, on the map, a dot was blinking. His Claire, had been at Bernardin at 8:17 p.m. yesterday, just like the letter had said, but then, after she'd called and said she was heading back to the hotel, the dot had moved to a bar down the street where she'd stayed until midnight, which she hadn't mentioned, and it had been a punch to the solar plexus, because she'd lied, or at least kept something from him, and keeping something from him was almost worse, because a lie can be forgiven, but silence is like a shadow you can't catch. He put the phone down, stood up, paced the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the house, where even the birds singing outside seemed to mock his confusion, and he tried to rationalize. Maybe she had just gone into the bar with the team, maybe it had been spontaneous, and she hadn't wanted to disturb him, but then why not tell him? Why had her voice been so distracted yesterday, as if she were hiding something, and why did he, Michael, the man who had always prided himself on his calm, his faith in their marriage, now feel like a detective in his own life, hunting for clues, as if Claire were a suspect and not his wife, his love, his everything? He remembered their last conversation, her "I was with the team, tired," and how he swallowed his questions, afraid that a direct conversation would break the thin thread that still connected them. But now, looking at the map in the app, he realized that he could no longer remain silent, because this shadow of truth that he saw in her silences, in the letters, in that photo from the corporate event, was growing like a storm on the horizon, and if he did not ask now, it would swallow him whole. Michael picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the screen, and began typing a message, the words building slowly, as if each letter weighed a ton. "Claire, I know about dinner with Ethan at Bernardin. Why didn't you tell me it was in person? What's going on?" He reread the text, his heart pounding like a drum, and he almost deleted it because it was an accusation, direct, without softening. But then he thought of the check from LA, of the photo with the man, of the emails where Ethan had written, "Can't wait to see you alone," and he hit send, feeling something inside him crumble, as if he'd just launched a missile that couldn't be brought back. He waited for her answer, watching the screen where the three dots that showed she was typing appeared and disappeared, and each second felt like an eternity until finally her answer came. "Mike, it was just a work dinner, nothing personal." "What makes you think that?" "I'm tired. Let's talk tomorrow after the presentation." And that answer, so short, so evasive, was like a knife, because she didn't deny it, but she didn't explain it either. And that "let's talk tomorrow" sounded like an excuse, like she was postponing the inevitable, and he felt a mixture of rage and despair, because he wanted to believe her, but he couldn't, not now, when everything was falling into place, the picture he was afraid to see. In a New York hotel conference room where the air was thick with coffee and tension, Claire stood in front of a projector, her voice confident, each word sharp as a blade, her eyes green as a forest after rain, gliding over the faces of her clients, men and women in suits, their gazes a mix of skepticism and interest, and she knew this was her moment, her chance to prove that she was more than just a marketing executive, but a visionary who could change the game. The presentation flowed smoothly, the slides moving, the charts coming to life as she explained, and when she finished, talking about how their brand could go viral on social media, there was a hush in the room, and then applause, not loud but hearty, and the main client, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a keen gaze, nodded. "Impressive, Claire. We'll talk about the details, but it's a strong start." Claire smiled, her heart pounding with adrenaline, but also proud inside because she had done it. She had pulled it off, and it was a triumph she wanted to share with Michael, to call him right now, to say, "Babe, I did it." But her phone vibrated in her bag, and she stole a glance at the screen, seeing a message from him, and her smile faded because the words "in person" and "what's going on" hit her like lightning, making her freeze because how did he know about Ethan, and why was his tone so accusatory? She left the room, apologizing to her team, and sat in a corner of the lobby where the soft chairs and dim lighting gave the illusion of privacy, even though people were milling about, and her fingers hovered over the keypad of her phone because what to say, how to explain that dinner with Ethan had been nothing, just a work meeting that had gone a little overboard but meant nothing, and how to say it in a way that he would believe when it already sounded like he didn't believe her. And that scared her because Michael had never been like that. He was her rock, her home, and the idea that he suspected her of something was a crack in the foundation of their marriage that she hadn't seen before, but now felt in every fiber of her being. She wrote back, trying to remain calm, but inside her thoughts were racing. Did he know about the letters? About the photo? Where did he get the personal meeting? And why hadn't she told him everything herself, hadn't mentioned Ethan to avoid this? But then, in the restaurant, it had seemed such a small thing, just a little flirtation that she'd stopped. And why worry Michael when he was already worried about her trips? But now her silence had backfired on her, and she felt a wall growing between them, and it was her fault, or his, or both of them, and she didn't know how to fix it, but she knew she had to, because she loved him, and the thought of him thinking differently was unbearable. Claire walked back to her room, her hands still shaking from the mix of euphoria from the presentation and anxiety from Michael's message, and she tried to focus on work, on the emails from clients, on the congratulations from the team, but her thoughts kept returning to him, to his voice, to the way he'd looked at her at the airport, and she knew she couldn't wait until tomorrow, that she needed to call, to explain, but the fear that he knew more than he was telling her was paralyzing her, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice and one wrong move could ruin everything. She dialed his number, but he didn't answer, and that silence was louder than any words, making her suspect that he was digging deeper, that he'd seen something she didn't want him to see, and it made her vulnerable in a way she'd never felt before, because Claire Bennett, the woman who had always been in control, suddenly felt like she was losing control of what mattered most, their marriage. Michael, sitting in the living room, where the shadows from the trees outside the window danced on the walls like ghosts of his doubts, looked at the missed call from Claire and didn't know if he wanted to talk, because her answer, so evasive, so empty, only strengthened his suspicions, and he felt the shadow of the truth getting closer, but he wasn't ready for it, because the truth could mean the end, and he still loved her despite everything, and it made him weak, vulnerable, but also determined, because he couldn't live in this half-darkness, where her every call, her every word seemed like a mystery. He stood up, poured himself another whiskey, although he knew it wouldn't help, and thought that tomorrow, when she called, he would ask her directly, without any reservations, and even if it hurt, the pain of truth was better than the agony of doubt, and this thought, so simple but so frightening, became his anchor that night when their perfect life was falling apart at the seams, and he didn't know if it could be saved. In the Bennett house, where the silence of the night was so thick you could cut it with a knife, Michael sat in the living room, lit only by the dim light of a desk lamp that cast long shadows on the walls, turning the familiar shapes of the furniture into ominous silhouettes, like reflections of his own fears, growing with each passing minute like weeds, suffocating everything rational in his soul. His phone was on the coffee table, the screen flashing with a notification from a location tracking app, and the dot representing Claire burned on the map like a beacon guiding him to the abyss. She was not at the hotel, as she had claimed in her last call, but at a bar on the corner of 52nd Street and Lexington Avenue, a place called the Velvet Room, which, according to online reviews, served cocktails with names like Midnight Sin and attracted a crowd hungry not only for booze but also for adventure. It was 11:42 p.m. and Claire, his Claire, who had texted an hour ago that she was going to bed, tired after the presentation, was there in that bar, and that lie or omission, which was worse, hit him like a hammer, shattering the last vestiges of his trust, and he felt something hot and toxic boiling in his chest, a mix of anger and pain and humiliation that made him jump up, grab his phone and open the app again, as if checking it again would change reality. But the dot wasn't gone. It was blinking, taunting him, and he imagined her there, in the dim light of the bar, drinking a glass of wine, laughing with Ethan Hayes, or the man in the photo, or someone else he didn't even know. And the image was so vivid, so painful, that he threw the phone on the couch, unable to look any further. He paced the room, his steps quick and uneven, like a man trying to escape himself, and stopped at the window, looking out over the dark garden where their maple tree, planted the first year after their wedding, swayed in the wind, as if reminding him of a time when things had been simpler, when he had never doubted her or them or their future. But now the future seemed like a mirage and the present a nightmare, and he didn't know how to stop this descent into madness, because every new detail, the check, the photo, the letters, now this dot in the bar added weight to his suspicions, and he felt like a drowning man clutching at straws, but the straw was his own fears, pulling him deeper. He grabbed his jacket and his keys and texted Ryan, "Are you at the bar? I need a drink. Right now." Ryan responded a minute later, "O'Malley's, same as always." "What's up, brother?" Michael didn't answer. He just walked out of the house, got into his car and drove, feeling the adrenaline mix with despair, and the road to the bar, usually so familiar, now seemed like a path into the unknown, where every turn could lead to answers or even more pain. O'Malley's was a typical Chicago pub, wood paneling, the smell of beer and fried wings, 80s rock playing on the speakers, and Ryan sitting behind the bar with an IPA in his hand, his usual half smile that said, "I'll listen, but don't expect me to be gentle." Michael plopped down on the stool next to him, ordered a whiskey, double, no ice, and drank it down in one gulp, feeling the alcohol burn in his throat, but bring no relief, because the pain was deeper, in his heart, in his soul, and no amount of alcohol could dull it. "Dude, you look like you've been run over by a truck," Ryan said, setting the bottle down and turning to look at him, his eyebrows raised in mild surprise, but his eyes serious, because he knew Michael too well, knew when his friend was on edge, and right now that edge was visible in the tensed set of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes were looking across the bar into space. "She lied again, Ryan," Michael began, his voice rough, like the words were scraping against his throat. "She said she was asleep, and she was at a bar in New York City at midnight. I checked on the app, and this was after she'd had dinner with this Ethan guy, who she also didn't tell anyone about. I texted her, asked her point blank, and she brushed me off like I was the idiot who came up with the problem." He pulled out his phone and showed Ryan the map with the blinking dot, and Ryan frowned but took his time answering, as if weighing what to say so as not to add fuel to the fire. "Mike, listen," Ryan began, his tone calm but firm, like a man who knew he was walking through a minefield. "I know it seems like shit. The period at the bar, the emails, all of it. But you're in a spiral right now, bro. You're digging, you're spying, and every piece you find seems like proof of cheating. Maybe she's at the bar with her coworkers, celebrating the deal. Maybe she didn't tell you because she didn't want to burden you. You know, Claire, she's always been obsessed with her work. But I'll tell you this, if you don't talk to her directly, not over text, but face to face, you're going to go crazy. And I don't want to see you destroy yourself over what could just be a misunderstanding." Michael shook his head, ordered another whiskey, and his knuckles turned white around the glass. "Ryan, I want to believe that this is nothing, but it all adds up, the check, the photos, the letters, now this. I feel like the idiot who's the last one to know that his wife, that she..." He couldn't finish because the word cheating was too hard, too final, and he took a sip to get it out of his throat, but it lingered like a bitter taste. Ryan put a hand on his shoulder, his voice quieter, almost soulful. "Look, I've been through this. Remember when I checked my ex's phone? I found nothing, but I lost her because I didn't trust her. If Claire is yours, if you love her, give her a chance to explain herself. But not like this, not in a drunken stupor, not over text. Call her tomorrow when you're sober and say, 'I saw this. Explain. And look her in the eye when she comes back. Because otherwise, you're just going to drown in this shit, Mike." Michael nodded, but his mind was a seething cauldron of anger and pain and love all fighting each other, and he didn't know if he could wait until tomorrow, because every minute Claire was in that bar was like a knife going deeper, and he pulled out his phone, opened her chat, and without thinking, under the influence of whiskey and rage, he wrote, "You're at the bar, Claire, at midnight. Said you were asleep. Is this your job? Are you with him? With Ethan? I'm not stupid." He hit send, and his heart sank, as if he'd just jumped off a cliff, and now all he could do was wait to see if he would fall or rise. In New York, in the Velvet Room, where the lights were dim and the music was jazzy, with soft saxophone notes, Claire sat at a table with two of her teammates, Alex and Sarah, and their laughter clinked like glasses they had raised to the success of the presentation that morning, like the triumph that still warmed her inside despite her fatigue, despite the shadow that had fallen on her heart after Michael's message. She took a sip of her cocktail, something with gin and lavender, and tried to focus on the conversation, on the way Sarah was joking about the client who had almost fallen asleep on her slide. But her mind was elsewhere, with Michael, with his words, in person, and what's going on. And she felt a growing anxiety inside her, as if she had missed something important, something that would explain his coldness, his tone, which was not just tired but wounded, and it scared her because she didn't understand what was happening at home, thousands of miles away, where her husband, her Michael, was becoming a stranger. She didn't notice how the time passed midnight, how the bar filled with people, and when her phone vibrated again, she looked at the screen and froze, seeing a new message from Michael, and the words, "You're at the bar," with Ethan, "I'm not stupid," were like a slap in the face, making her choke, because how did he know? And why did he think that she was with Ethan? And what did this accusation mean, which hit right in the heart? Claire excused herself from her coworkers and went outside into the cold New York air and tried to call him. But he didn't answer, and she stood there under the neon sign of the bar feeling like the world was falling apart because she wasn't with Ethan. She was with the team. And yeah, she hadn't told him she was going to the bar because it was spontaneous, and she didn't want to bother him. But now her silence was backfiring on her, and she realized he knew more than he was letting on, and it was like a trap she'd set herself up to fall into. She wrote back, her fingers shaking. "Mike, I was with Alex and Sarah celebrating the presentation. Not Ethan. What makes you think that? I was asleep when you wrote about dinner, and I just saw it now. Please, let's talk." But she knew it sounded weak, like an excuse, and she sent it, feeling tears sting her eyes, because she loved him, and the thought that he thought otherwise was unbearable, and she didn't know how to make it up to him when he didn't answer, when he seemed to have already decided that she was to blame. Michael, back home, collapsed on the couch, his head still spinning from the whiskey, and he looked at her text that had come 3 hours later, and the words, "with Alex and Sarah," felt like a lie to him, because she hadn't mentioned the bar, she hadn't called right away, and that silence, that gap in time, was like an abyss he was falling into. And he didn't answer because he didn't know what to say, he didn't know whether to believe her, and that breaking point, where his paranoia became reality, was the moment when their communication, their trust, their love was at risk, and he felt like he was on the edge, not knowing whether to step forward or retreat. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. In the Bennett house, the night seemed endless, as if time had frozen in viscous resin, and Michael, sitting on the couch in the living room, where the dim light of the lamp cast shadows like claws clinging to the walls, looked at his phone, where Claire's message, "Mike, I was with Alex and Sarah celebrating the presentation. Not with Ethan. Why do you think that? I was asleep when you wrote about dinner. I just saw it now. Please, let's talk," burned on the screen like an accusation, like a mockery, because her words, so logical at first glance, did not extinguish the fire in his chest, but only added fuel, because she did not explain why she lied about the hotel, why she did not call right away, why her answer came 3 hours later, and this silence, this gap in time was like an abyss into which he was falling, unable to cling to something solid. His fingers were gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles were white, and he could feel the anger mixed with pain pulsing in his temples, like his head was going to explode, and he wanted to text back, to scream into the text that he wasn't stupid, that he could see through her lies, but instead he just stared at the screen, paralyzed by the fear that if he texted any more it would be the end, the end of their marriage, their love, their everything, and the thought was unbearable because despite everything, the check, the photo, the letters, the bar, he still loved her, and it made him weak, vulnerable, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to jump or retreat. In New York, in a hotel room where the lights of Manhattan sparkled like stars outside the window, but seemed cold and distant, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking, her phone lying next to her, the screen still glowing from her last text, waiting for a response, waiting for something to say that Michael believed her, that he was still her Michael, the one who held her after long days, who laughed at her jokes, who looked at her like she was the center of his world. But his silence, that damned silence, was louder than any words, and it cut her like a knife, because she didn't understand how they had gotten to this point, how her husband, her rock, was suddenly accusing her of cheating on her, of being with Ethan while she was with her colleagues, celebrating a success that should have been their shared triumph, because this promotion she had learned about this morning after the presentation was her gift to both of them, vice president of marketing. More money, more opportunities, a bigger house, maybe even a baby, which they talked about at night, lying in bed, making plans that seemed so real. She didn't tell him right away. She wanted to make a surprise, to fly home with the news, with a smile, with a bottle of champagne. But now this surprise, this secret of hers, became another wall between them, and she felt her heart squeeze with fear that he wouldn't believe her, that he had already decided that she was guilty, and this thought was like poison, slowly poisoning her joy of success. Claire dialed his number, her fingers shaking, and she prayed that he would answer, that his voice, so familiar, so dear, would bring her back to reality, where they were still a team, but the rings kept coming, and he didn't pick up, and that was like another blow, like confirmation that he had turned his back on her, and she felt the tears sting her eyes. But she didn't let them fall because Claire Bennett didn't cry. She solved problems. She always found a way. And now she decided that enough texts, enough unsaid things, they were going to talk, right now, on video, so he could see her eyes, her face, so he could know that she wasn't lying, that she loved him, and that all of this, the bar, Ethan, all of this was just a misunderstanding. She opened the video calling app, tapped his name, and the screen lit up as she waited to be connected, her heart pounding as if she were standing in front of a room of clients again. But this was worse because there she knew what to do, and here, with Michael, she felt lost, like the rules of the game had changed, and she hadn't had time to learn them. Michael heard the video call, and his stomach tightened, like someone had tied a knot in his stomach, because he wasn't ready to see her, wasn't ready for her voice, for her face that he loved, but that now represented lies, betrayal, and yet he couldn't ignore her, couldn't just turn away, because this was Claire, his Claire, and he hit accept and her face appeared on the screen, her eyes so green, so familiar, but now with a hint of worry, and she looked tired but determined, like she'd gathered up all the courage she could to speak. "Mike," she began, her voice shaking but firm. "What's going on? What makes you think I'm with Ethan? I was with Alex and Sarah. We were celebrating. It was a spur of the moment. I didn't think it was important. I didn't want to worry you. But you're accusing me of cheating on you. How can you?" Her words were like bullets, each one hitting its mark. But instead of calming him down, they only angered him, because she hadn't explained the bar, hadn't explained Ethan, hadn't explained why her answers were always so evasive, and he felt the anger, fueled by whiskey and lack of sleep, boiling over. "Claire, don't lie to me." His voice was louder than he'd intended, and he saw her flinch, her eyes widening, but he couldn't stop himself. "You said you were asleep, but you were at the bar until midnight. When I saw it, I checked the app. And this Ethan, his emails, his intimate meetings, his can't wait to see you alone. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see how you've changed? The new perfume, the late calls, the secrets. I found the receipt in your bag, Claire, 2 cocktails, late at night when you were supposedly asleep. What am I supposed to think?" His words poured out like a river breaking a dam, and he watched her face change from shock to anger. Her lips pressed together, and she leaned closer to the screen, her eyes flashing like lightning. "You were checking my location. You were going through my bag. Michael, how could you?" Her voice had broken, and now she was screaming. Her cheeks were flushed, and she looked like she was ready to throw the phone across the room. "You don't trust me, after everything we've been through?" "Yeah, I was at the bar with my coworkers because we closed a deal, because I was working my ass off to build a future for us. And Ethan? Those were work emails, Mike, work emails. He was flirting, yeah, but I made it clear that I was married, that I loved you. But you're spying on me like some kind of detective. Do you really think I'm capable of cheating on you?" She fell silent, her chest heaving, and he saw the tears glistening in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall, and it was like a blow, because he knew she wasn't crying, not in public, not in front of him, and if she was close to it, then he had cut her deep, but his own pain was greater, and he couldn't back down. "Then why don't you tell me the truth, Claire? Why didn't you tell me about the bar, about Ethan, about all of this?" He was nearly screaming, his voice shaking with rage and desperation, and he could feel the tears stinging his own eyes. But he wouldn't let them fall, not now, not in front of her. "I don't want to be that guy who spies, but you made me. Your secrets, your trips, your smiles in photos with other men. I don't know who you are back in New York, but you're not the Claire I had with me." His words hung in the air like toxic smoke, and he saw her face twist as if he'd hit her, and for a moment he regretted it, wanting to take it all back, but it was too late. "You don't know who I am." Her voice was quiet but full of pain, and it was worse than a scream because it was filled with not only rage but betrayal, like he had destroyed something sacred. "I'm the one who works himself to the bone so we could have a better life. I'm the one who loves you even though you don't trust me. And if you think I'm cheating, then maybe you're not the Michael I knew." She paused, her eyes flashing, and she hit end call, the screen going black, leaving Michael in a silence where his own breath sounded like a roar, and he felt the world crumble because he wanted the truth. But not this breakup, not this pain that was both of theirs now. Michael sat in the dark, his hands shaking, and he didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours, but he couldn't stay still. He couldn't just sit there and drown in this chaos. And he got up, he went upstairs to their bedroom, where her scent still hung in the air, where her pillow lay untouched. And he stopped at the closet, her closet, where she kept her dresses, her shoes, all the things that made her Claire, and he didn't know why he opened the door, but his hands moved on their own, as if they were looking for something that would prove or disprove his fears. He was going through her things, the neatly folded sweaters, the boxes of jewelry, and then he came across a small black box, hidden behind a stack of scarves, and his heart sank because he knew it wasn't her style, it wasn't her box, and he opened it, feeling his blood run cold, and there was a man's watch, silver, expensive, with an engraving on the back that said, "For a special person," and he immediately thought of Ethan, and how she could have bought it for him, for this man who wrote to her, unforgettable, and it was like the final blow, like the proof he'd been dreading but looking for, and he collapsed on the bed, clutching the box in his hands, feeling the tears finally break through because it was too real, and he didn't know how to live with it, how to live without her, if it was true. Claire, in her room, sat on the floor, leaning against the bed, her face wet with the tears she had finally allowed herself to cry, and she felt betrayed, not just by Michael, but by herself, because her silence, her desire to surprise him with a promotion, her attempt to balance work and marriage had led to this, to the fight, to his accusations, to him thinking she was capable of cheating. She remembered buying that watch, for him, for Michael, choosing it with such love, imagining how he would smile when he saw the engraving, how they would celebrate her promotion, their future. But now that box, hidden in the closet so he wouldn't find it before time, was another secret that he would probably never understand, and she felt her heart breaking because she loved him, but his mistrust, his anger was like a knife, and she didn't know how to heal that wound, how to get him back, how to get them back, and that collision, that explosion, was the moment when their love, their trust, their everything was on the edge, and she was afraid that they had already passed the point where they could fix everything. Michael didn't sleep that night. He lay on his bed, clutching the watch box, and his thoughts were spinning like crows, now blaming Claire, now himself, now both of them, and he didn't know what to do next. But he knew he couldn't go on like this, in this hell of suspicion and pain, and he decided that in the morning he would call her, tell her everything, ask about the watch, about Ethan, about everything, and let it be the end or the beginning, but he couldn't live in this half-darkness any longer. Claire, in New York, was also awake, staring at the ceiling where the reflections of the city lights made patterns like cracks, and she thought about how to get home, how to explain, how to show him that she was his, only his, and that her secrets were for them, not against them, but the fear that he wouldn't believe, that he had already gone too far, was like chains binding her, and she knew that their next meeting would be decisive, and that scared her more than any presentation, because it wasn't a career that was at stake, it was their love. Michael got out of bed, still clutching the watch box, and his steps were heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of their marriage on his shoulders, which now seemed as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. He went down to the kitchen, where the morning light was already filtering through the curtains, and set the box on the table, next to his cold mug of coffee, and looked at it as if it were evidence in a case he had forced upon himself. The watch was beautiful, too beautiful, with a leather strap and a dial that caught the light as if it were mocking him, and the engraving, for a special person, was like a knife in the heart, because he wanted to believe it was for him, that it was a gift from her, like the sweaters or books she had given him for his birthdays, but his mind, poisoned by suspicion, painted a different picture. Claire handing the watch to Ethan, their smiles, their closeness, and the thought was unbearable, like poison he was pouring into himself. He remembered their first anniversary, when she had given him a fountain pen engraved with "Yours Forever," and how he had laughed at the time, saying it was too sentimental, but inside he had been so touched that he had kept the pen in his desk drawer as a talisman of their love. And now, looking at his watch, he wondered if he had ever been her special person, or if someone else had taken that place. He opened the fridge and took out a bottle of water, but he didn't drink it, just held it in his hands, feeling the cold of the glass, as if it could cool his thoughts, and he remembered Ryan's words at the bar. Talk to her face to face, Mike. Not by text, not in a drunken stupor. But how to talk when every word she said seemed like a lie, when her eyes, even through the screen, were full of pain but also anger, and he didn't know who to believe, her or his fears. He went back to the living room, sat down on the couch where his phone was still lying, and opened their correspondence, rereading her messages, her "I was with colleagues," her "Why do you think that?" And every word was like a puzzle that didn't fit together, because he didn't know where the truth was and where his imagination was, and this uncertainty was the worst of all, because it left him hanging, like a person who is standing on the edge of an abyss but doesn't know whether to fall or retreat. It was a gray morning in New York, the sky overcast, and Claire stood at the window of her hotel room, looking out at a city that usually inspired her, but today seemed alien, as if its energy had turned away from her, mirroring her own turmoil. She had been awake most of the night, her eyes were red, but she had carefully hidden it with makeup, because Claire Bennett did not show weakness, even when her world was falling apart. She thought about the call, about his accusations, about how his voice, so familiar, had become alien, full of rage, and it was like losing a part of herself, because Michael had been her home, her safe place, and now it was burning, and she did not know how to put out the fire. She remembered their wedding, how he'd danced with her to an old Frank Sinatra song, how he'd whispered in her ear that she was his everything, and how she'd believed then that they were invincible, that no distance, no business trips could separate them. But now those business trips, her career, her ambitions had become a wall, and she blamed herself for not telling him everything about the promotion, about Ethan, about the bar, because she'd wanted to protect him, she'd wanted him to be proud of her, and instead he'd thought she was cheating, and it was like a knife in her heart, because she'd never, ever looked at another man the way she looked at him. She opened her laptop to check her client emails to distract herself, but her thoughts kept returning to Michael, to his words, "You're not that Claire," and she felt the anger rise again, because how could he think like that? How could he spy on her, go through her things, check her location like she was a criminal? She wanted to call him again, but the fear that he wouldn't answer, or worse, that he would answer in the same accusatory tone, stopped her, and she just sat there, staring at the screen where the email from her boss confirmed her promotion, and this, what should have been her triumph, now seemed empty, because without Michael, without his smile, without his support, it meant nothing. She remembered buying that watch, how she spent a long time choosing it in a jewelry store, imagining him wearing it, how it would sparkle on his wrist as he worked on his designs, and how she wanted to engrave something simple but sincere because he was her special person, always had been, but now she was afraid that he would find it, that he would think it was for someone else, and that thought was like another crack in their marriage that was already falling apart. Michael, back in the bedroom, put the box with the watch back in the closet, but he couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, and he decided he couldn't wait, he had to know now, and he picked up his phone again, texting her. "I found the watch, Claire. Who is it for? Ethan, tell me the truth." He sent the message without reading it because he knew that if he started thinking about it, he wouldn't send it, and he waited, staring at the screen, but there was no answer, and that silence was the worst of all because it confirmed his worst fears, and he felt the tears coming again, but he pushed them away because he didn't want to be weak. He didn't want to be the one crying when his world was falling apart. Claire, seeing his new message, felt her heart sink because the watch, her gift, her love, had become another accusation, and she didn't know how to explain, how to say that it was for him without ruining the surprise, which now seemed stupid, unnecessary, and she wrote, "Mike, it's not what you think. I'm not with Ethan. The watch is not for him. Please believe me. I'll fly over tomorrow. We'll talk." But she knew it sounded weak, that he wouldn't believe it, and she felt like their marriage, their love, their everything was hanging by a thread, and this collision, this explosion of emotions, was the moment when they both stood on the edge, and no one knew if they would fall or find a way to get back to each other. It was a cool morning in Chicago, with a light breeze that blew fallen leaves across the paths of Riverside Park, where Michael walked next to Ryan, their sneakers crunching on the gravel, the air smelling of dampness and approaching fall in a way that seemed all too symbolic, as if nature were mirroring his own internal disintegration, where everything that had been solid and reliable was crumbling like dry leaves underfoot. He had been up most of the night, his eyes red and his face drawn, still clutching his phone in the pocket of his jacket, where the last text from Claire, "Mike, I'm flying home. Please, let's talk." "I love you" had gone unanswered because he didn't know what to say, didn't know whether to believe her words, with the box containing the watch, with that damn engraving "for a special someone," lying on their bed like a grenade, ready to explode at the slightest touch. He called Ryan early in the morning, almost in a panic, and asked to meet him not at the bar, not at their usual place where the noise and beer drowned out their thoughts, but here in the park, where the silence might bring clarity, but instead he felt only chaos, as if his mind were a maze where every turn led to new questions, new fears, new evidence that Claire, his Claire, was no longer his. Ryan walked beside him, his hands stuffed in his jeans pockets, his eyes scanning the trees as if he were searching for answers he didn't have, but his presence, solid as an old oak tree, was the only thing keeping Michael from completely spiraling into madness. "Well, tell me what else," Ryan said, his voice low, a little raspy from last night's beer, but with the same directness that always made Michael feel heard, even if the answers weren't what he wanted. Michael stopped at the bench and sat down, his shoulders slumping, and he began to speak, his words coming out ragged, like he was spitting out shards of glass. "I found a watch, Ryan, a man's watch, an expensive one, in her closet, hidden away, engraved with 'for a special person,' and she was at the bar when she said she was sleeping. And these letters from Ethan, where he wrote about personal meetings. I asked her directly, but she brushed it off, said it was work, that I was making it up. But how can I trust it when it all fits together?" He looked up at Ryan, searching his face for some hint that he was wrong, that this was all paranoia, but Ryan only frowned, his brows drawing together as if he were weighing something heavy. "Dude," Ryan began, sitting down next to me and looking out at the river where the water flowed lazily, reflecting the gray sky. "I don't want to pour sugar syrup into your ears because you're my friend and you deserve the truth. When I was divorcing Emily, it was the same thing. I'd find Piece's texts, late calls, her work dinners. I'd tell myself it was nothing, that she was just busy, but then I'd find texts where she called some guy honey and arranged to meet up. And you know what the worst part is? She swears it was nothing, that I made it all up, but I saw her eyes, saw the way she looked away, and it was like a knife. I'm not saying Claire is like that, but those watches, those lies about the bar, the letters, those aren't just coincidences, Mike. You have to ask her directly, no texts, no videos, when she's coming back, and look her in the eyes. If he's lying, you'll understand. His words were like a cold shower, harsh but honest, and Michael felt his heart squeeze, because Ryan, with his cynical look, with his scars from the divorce, was the only one who didn't try to comfort him, but told him like it was, and it was scary, but also gave him a strange feeling of support, as if someone finally understood his pain. Michael nodded, looking down at his hands, which were nervously fiddling with the hem of his jacket, and said, I tried to talk, yesterday, on video. She screamed that I didn't trust her, that I was spying. And I was spying, Ryan. I was checking her location, going through her mail, her things. I became someone I never wanted to be. But I can't stop, because if I don't find out the truth, I'll go crazy. Ryan chuckled, but there was no judgment in his chuckling, only understanding, as if he himself had once been in this same place, on this same edge. You know, when I checked Emily's phone, I felt like shit, but I didn't regret it. Because it's better to know than to live in an illusion. But I'll tell you this, Mike, if you dig, be prepared for what you find. And if it's true, if she's with someone, you have to decide what to do next. Because living with it, pretending that everything is okay, is not living. Michael was silent. His gaze fell on the river, where a leaf was spinning in a whirlpool, and he felt like the same leaf, sucked into a vortex from which there was no escape. In New York, at JFK Airport, where the hum of voices and announcements created an endless background noise, Claire sat in a cafe clutching a latte that was already cold, because she couldn't drink, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but Michael, his messages, his accusations, and this gap that was growing between them with each passing minute. She was waiting for a flight to Chicago, her suitcase at her feet, her phone on the table, the screen dark, no new messages, and the silence was like a knife, stabbing deeper with each passing hour. She wanted to call him. She wanted to scream that he was wrong, that the clock was nothing to him, that Ethan was nothing, just a coworker who had overstepped his bounds. But she stopped herself from doing so. But the fear that he wouldn't believe her, that he had already decided that she was guilty, bound her like chains. She opened her contacts, scrolled to the name Sarah Brooks, her friend from college, who had always been her voice of reason, her anchor when things were going wrong, and dialed her number, her voice shaking as she said, Sarah, I need you. Everything is falling apart. Sarah lived in New York, in a small apartment in Brooklyn where the walls were covered with her watercolors and the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and lavender candles, and Claire, straight from the airport, had collapsed on the couch, her eyes red but holding on because she didn't want to cry, didn't want to be weak, not even in front of Sarah, who knew her better than anyone. Claire, what happened? Sarah asked, sitting down across from her dark curls falling over her shoulders, her eyes full of worry, as if they could see everything Claire was hiding. And Claire told her about the presentation, about the promotion, about dinner with Ethan, about the bar, about Michael, his accusations, his spying, about the watch that was supposed to be a surprise, but became another wall. He thinks I'm cheating, Sarah. He found the watch. He thinks it's for Ethan. I wanted to surprise him, but now he doesn't believe me, and I don't know how to fix it. Sarah listened, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater, and when Claire finished, she sighed, her voice soft but firm, like someone who knows the truth can hurt. Claire, I love you, but you made a mistake. You didn't tell him about Ethan, about the bar, about the promotion. You thought you were protecting him, but to him it felt like secrets. And you know what worries me? Last week he texted me, asking if I'd noticed anything strange about you, if you'd talked about someone. I said no, because it was true. But Claire, he wasn't just asking me. He texted Jessica, Mark. He's looking for confirmation, and that's not okay. Claire froze, her heart clenching, because the thought of Michael calling their friends, poking around in her life, felt like a betrayal. But at the same time, she understood why he was doing it, and that made the pain even worse. What should I do, Sarah? Her voice was almost a whisper, and she felt the tears welling up again, but she pushed them away because she didn't want to be the one breaking down. Sarah leaned closer, took her hand. Be honest. Completely. Tell him about the promotion, about the watch, about Ethan. Don't keep anything secret, no matter how small. Because every little thing is proof to him right now. And when you come back, sit down with him, look him in the eye, and say, I love you, and I'm not hiding anything. But Claire, be prepared for him not to believe you right away. He's hurt, and that's blinding him. Claire nodded, her throat tightening, and she felt hope, small and fragile, flare inside her, because Sarah was right. Honesty was her only chance. But the fear that Michael was already too far gone, that he had already decided she was guilty, was like a shadow following her. Michael and Ryan left the park, and Michael insisted on going to Ryan's house, his Lincoln Park apartment, where the clutter of books and guitars and empty beer bottles created an atmosphere that was both cozy and chaotic, like Ryan himself. They sat on the couch, Ryan opening a beer, and Michael refused because he wanted clarity, wanted his thoughts to be sharp as a blade. I don't know how to look her in the eye, Ryan, he said, his voice quiet but full of pain. I want to believe her, but watch. It's like the proof I've been afraid of. Ryan shook his head, his gaze hard. Then ask her about it, directly. And if she's lying, you'll see. But Mike, be prepared for the truth to not be what you want. I've been there, and it hurts, but it's better to know than to live in that hell. Michael nodded, but inside he felt his love for Claire fighting with his fears, and he didn't know which would win. Claire, back at the airport, sat at the gate, her flight delayed, looking at her phone, no new messages from Michael, and the silence was like a sentence, but Sarah's words echoed in her head. Be honest. She opened her notes, started to write a letter, a long one, telling him everything about the promotion, about Ethan, about the bar, about the watch, but she didn't send it because she knew she had to say it in person, looking into his eyes, and she prayed that he would give her a chance, that their love would be stronger than this pain, this rift that their allies, Ryan and Sarah, had unwittingly reinforced, each with their own truth, their own support, their own shadow. It was a gray morning in New York, with heavy clouds hanging over Manhattan, as if to mirror the storm inside Claire, who sat in the corner of a coffee shop on the corner of 42nd Street, the smell of freshly brewed espresso mingling with the hum of conversation and the clink of spoons on porcelain cups. Her phone lay on the table, the screen dark, with no new messages from Michael, and the silence was like an emptiness growing inside her, displacing the joy of the news she had received an hour earlier. Her boss, the stern but fair Linda Carter, had called to confirm a promotion to vice president of marketing, a salary that made Claire pause for a moment, because it wasn't just a step up, it was a leap, a ticket to the life she and Michael had dreamed of, a house on a lake, travel, maybe even the baby they had been putting off until everything fell into place. But now, sitting with the latte growing cold in her hands, she felt not triumph but emptiness, because this success, this moment that should have been their celebration, was overshadowed by his silence, his accusations, his mistrust, and she wondered if it would all be worth it if she lost him, the man she had worked so hard to build their future for. Claire looked out the window, where people were hurrying under umbrellas, their silhouettes blurred in the rainy haze, and her thoughts went back to their last video call, to his voice full of anger, to his words, "You are not that Claire," that cut her like a blade, because she was the same Claire who loved him, who chose him every day, despite the pressure of work, despite the temptations, despite Ethan's light flirtations that she cut short because her heart belonged to Michael and only him. But his suspicions, his spying, his questions about the watch she bought for him, so lovingly choosing the engraving for a special person, became a wall that she did not know how to break down. She remembered the conversation she had with Sarah, her advice to be honest, and now, sitting in this coffee shop, she realized she couldn't wait until tomorrow, couldn't sit through another client meeting, smiling, pretending everything was okay when her marriage was falling apart. She opened the airline app, her fingers moving quickly, almost instinctively, and in a few minutes she had a ticket for an evening flight to Chicago. She would cut the trip short, come home, look him in the eye, and tell him everything. about the promotion, about Ethan, about the watch, about the bar. She didn't know if he'd believe her, but she knew she had to try, because without him, her success was as empty as this coffee shop, full of people but so alone. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it, expecting to see Michael's name, but it was an email from Linda. "Claire, you've made us proud. I'll see you in the office next week to discuss new projects. Celebrate." Claire smiled, but it was a bitter smile because celebrating without Michael was impossible, and she felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she pushed them away because Claire Bennett didn't cry in public. She kept it together even when her world was falling apart. She wrote a reply to Linda, short and professional, and then opened her notes, where she began writing a letter to Michael, the words pouring out slowly, as if each one required effort. "Mike, I'm flying home today. I haven't cheated on you ever. The watch is for you. The promotion is for us. I love you, and I want to make things right." She didn't send it, deciding she would say it in person, but writing the words was like an anchor, keeping her from falling into the abyss of despair. She finished her coffee, packed her things, and headed to the airport, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope, because she knew their meeting would be crucial, and she was afraid he was already too far away to hear her. In Chicago, in Pages and Pores in the West Loop, where the smell of old books mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, Michael wandered the shelves, his fingers sliding over the spines, but he didn't see the titles, didn't hear the soft music coming from the speakers, because his mind was elsewhere, with Claire, with the clock, with her last text message that he had never answered because he didn't know how. He had come here for distraction, to find refuge in a familiar place, where he and Claire often spent Saturday mornings choosing books, arguing about whether to read another biography or a mystery, and where he always felt at home because she was there, her laughter filling the space, her hand brushing his as she reached for a book. But now he was alone, and the store felt alien, as if her absence had sucked all the warmth out of it, and he felt like a stranger in his own life. He paused at a shelf of journals and notebooks, and his gaze fell on a small leather notebook, similar to the ones Claire kept at home, where she wrote down her thoughts, her to-do lists, the occasional poem that she was embarrassed to show him, but that he found fascinating because it was so hers. He remembered how, a couple of weeks ago, on one of her sleepless nights, he had found her journal on her nightstand, open to a page where she had written about work, about stress, about feeling trapped. The word had pricked him then, but he had dismissed it, thinking she was talking about work, about pressure. But now, standing in the store, the word came back like an echo, and he felt a chill run down his spine, because what if she meant their marriage? What if she felt trapped with him, with their life, with their home, with their dreams that now seemed so far away? He pulled out his phone, opened their conversation, reread her last message, and his fingers froze over the keyboard because he wanted to write, to ask what she meant, but the fear that her answer would confirm his worst fears stopped him. Michael walked out of the store, clutching the book he'd bought on the spot, some thriller he probably wouldn't read, and headed home, his steps heavy, like he was carrying the weight of their marriage on his shoulders. Once home, he went straight to the bedroom and opened the drawer of her nightstand where the journal was, his heart pounding like a drum because he knew this was wrong, that this was another step over the edge, but he couldn't stop, not with the word trapped burning in his head like a neon sign. He opened the journal, flipped through the pages, and found an entry dated a month ago. "I feel trapped. Work takes everything, and at home. I don't know how to tell Michael that I need more. More freedom, more time, more of us. I love him, but sometimes I feel suffocated, and I'm afraid he can't see it." His hands began to tremble, and he read the words again, each one like a blow, because he understood that she was not happy, that she wanted something else, and his mind, poisoned by suspicion, interpreted it as regret, as a desire to leave, as confirmation that the watch, the letters, the bar, all this was not an accident, but her attempt to escape from this trap. He collapsed on his bed, the journal still in his hands, and he felt the tears sting his eyes. But he didn't let them fall because he didn't want to be weak. He didn't want to be the one breaking. But inside he was already breaking, because the woman he loved, who was his everything, felt trapped with him. And it was worse than cheating on him, because it meant that their marriage, their love, Their everything was an illusion. He remembered Ryan's words in the park, his cynical look, his story about the divorce, and he thought that maybe he was right. Maybe the truth was the only way out, even if she tore him to pieces. He picked up his phone, wanted to text her, to ask about the journal, about her feelings. But instead, he just stared at the screen where her message was still hanging, and he didn't know what to do, because every cell in his body was screaming that he loved her, but his mind was whispering that she was already gone. At JFK, Claire sat at the gate, her flight delayed by weather, and she watched the rain outside, pattering on the glass like her own thoughts, jumbled, relentless. She thought about Michael, about his silence, about his accusations, and how she wanted to go home and hold him, tell him everything would be okay, but the fear that he wouldn't believe her, that he had already decided she was to blame, was like a shadow following her. She remembered their first night in their new house, lying on the living room floor surrounded by boxes, laughing, planning how they would live, how happy they would be, and she had believed then that their love was stronger than anything else: work, distance, time. But now she wondered if she had been too busy, too consumed by her career, to notice how he was growing distant, how his smiles were becoming rarer, and how his questions were becoming sharper. She opened her notes, reread her letter that she had never sent, and added, "I'm not trapped with you, Mike. I'm trapped with myself, with the way I try to be everything at once: wife, CEO, me. But I choose you always." She didn't send it, but the words were like a promise she'd made to herself that she would fight for him, for them, even if it hurt. The flight was finally called, and Claire stood, her heart heavy, but her determination burning inside her like a small fire that would not go out despite the storm. She knew that their meeting would be the climax, the moment of truth where they would either find their way back to each other or lose everything. She didn't know about the diary, about how Michael interpreted her words, but she felt that something had changed, that he was further away than ever, and it scared her, but she was ready, ready to talk, ready to show him that her love for him was not a trap, but her home, her everything. It was a quiet night in the Bennett house, but it was not a peaceful silence, but a heavy one, like the air before a thunderstorm, when every sound: the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of the wind outside the window, seems to be a harbinger of the storm. Michael sat in the living room, his fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of a sofa cushion, and on the table in front of him lay the evidence of his doubts. The black box with the watch and her diary, open to the page where the word "trap" burned like a brand burned into his heart. He had not slept, could not sleep, because he knew that Claire would be back soon. Her flight had landed an hour ago, and she had written a short, "I'll be home in 20 minutes," which he read but did not answer, because the words stuck in his throat like stones, and he did not know how to greet her, how to look her in the eyes, when all he felt was a mixture of love, pain, and anger that fought inside him like animals in a cage. He rehearsed in his head what he would say, how he would ask about the watch, about the diary, about Ethan, but each option sounded either like an accusation or a plea, and he hated himself for it, for having become a man who spied on his wife, who looked for proof instead of believing. The door opened with a soft click, and Claire walked in, her suitcase left by the threshold, her face lit by the soft light of the hallway, tired but determined, as if she had gathered all her strength for this moment. She saw him, sitting in the dim light, and her eyes slid to the table, to the clock, to the diary, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat, as if she realized that the battle she had feared had already begun. "Mike," she began, her voice quiet but firm, as if she had rehearsed her words as he had his. "I came back to talk, to explain." She took a step forward, but stopped when she saw his shoulders tense, his pained gaze meeting hers, and she felt her own heart squeeze, because this was not the Michael who had seen her off at the airport, not the one who had hugged her after long days, but a man she barely recognized, a man whose eyes were full of suspicion. Michael stood up, his movements jerky, like he was trying to keep himself from falling apart. "Explain?" His voice was hoarse, almost breaking, and he gestured to the table where the watch and journal lay. "Then explain this, Claire. The watch with the words for a special someone engraved on it, hidden in your closet, and your journal where you write about feeling trapped. Trapped, Claire, is this about us? About me? Or about him, about Ethan, the one you had dinner with, the one you were at the bar with when you said you were sleeping. His words were like bullets, each one hitting its mark, and he watched her face change from shock to pain to anger, and he knew he had gone too far, but he couldn't stop, because the truth he was looking for was the only thing that could either save him or destroy him. Claire stepped toward the table, her hands shaking, but she picked up the box with the watch, opened it, and her eyes, green as a forest after rain, were shining with the tears she was refusing to let fall. "This watch, Mike," her voice was shaking but full of strength. "It's for you. I bought it for our anniversary, for you, because you're my special person, you always have been. I hid it to surprise me, to see your smile when you opened it. And the journal." She picked up the notebook, her fingers squeezing it so hard her skin was white. "I wrote about work, how it takes everything, how I'm afraid of losing myself, my soul, and not you, not our marriage. I love you, Mike, and the thought that you think differently, that you've been spying on me, checking my things, my messages, it tears me apart." Her voice broke, and she fell silent, looking at him, waiting for him to say that he would believe, but his face remained tense, his eyes searching her gaze for lies, and it was like a knife in her heart. "I was spying, yeah," he said, his voice quieter but full of pain, like the confession was burning him from the inside. "I was checking your location, reading your letters, going through your things, because I was going crazy, Claire. I saw Ethan's letters, his 'I can't wait to see you alone' messages. I saw the receipt for the 2 drinks. I saw you at the bar when you said you were asleep. I wanted to believe you, but it added up to a pattern I couldn't ignore. And I hate myself for it, for becoming like this, but I didn't know how else to feel, with you always traveling, always with someone else, and me here, alone, trying to figure out who we were now." He fell silent, his chest heaving, and he felt tears stinging his eyes, but he didn't let them fall because he didn't want to be weak, not in front of her, not now, when everything was hanging by a thread. Claire stepped closer, her hands still clutching the watch box, and she looked at him, her eyes full of pain but also determination. "Mike, I didn't cheat on you. Ethan was a coworker who went too far, and I let him know that I was married, that I was yours. The bar was a spontaneous idea with Alex and Sarah. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you, because I thought it was a small thing. And the promotion. I wanted to surprise you. I wanted to fly home and tell you that I was vice president now, that we would have more money, time, opportunities. But I was wrong. I should have told you everything, and I'm sorry, but your mistrust, your spying. How can I live with that, Mike? How can I be with you if you don't believe me?" Her voice broke, and a tear finally rolled down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away because she wanted him to see her pain, her truth. Michael looked at her, his heart breaking because he wanted to believe. He wanted to rush to her, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but her words about not trusting her, about how his actions had hurt her, were like a mirror, showing him what he had become, a man who spied, who suspected, who destroyed the things he loved. "Claire, I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice almost a whisper, and he took a step toward her, but stopped because he didn't know if she would accept him. "I love you, but I don't know how to trust, not after all this. And I know it's my fault for going too far, but I don't know how to go back." They stood in the dim light of the living room, separated by a meter of space that felt like an abyss, and both were silent, their breathing the only sound filling the silence, and both knew that this moment, this showdown, had resolved their misunderstanding, but left scars that would not heal overnight. Claire put the watch box on the table, her fingers shaking, and she said, "I want us to try, Mike, but I don't know if I can forget that you didn't trust me. We need time, we need something more than words." She turned, picked up her suitcase, and walked upstairs, her steps heavy, and Michael watched her go, his heart clenching because the truth had been revealed, but their future was left uncertain, hanging by a thread they were both afraid to break. A week later, in a quiet Chicago cafe called Brew and Books, where the smell of coffee mingled with the aroma of fresh pastries and the soft light came through the large windows, Claire and Michael sat across from each other, their hands on the table but not touching, as if an invisible wall still separated them. They had come here after their first couples therapy session, where Dr. Lynn, a soft-spoken woman with piercing eyes, had gotten them to talk about their fears, about how they had gotten to this point, and though the conversation had been painful, it had been like the first breath after a long dive, difficult but necessary. Claire looked at Michael. His face was tired, but there was a sincere attempt in his eyes, and it gave her hope, though fragile as an autumn leaf. "I don't know how long this will take," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but I want us to try. I want us to be honest, even when it hurts." Michael nodded, his fingers fiddling nervously with a napkin. "I want that too, Claire. I know I screwed up, that my lack of trust, it almost destroyed us. But I'm willing to work on this on myself." That night, at home, Michael sat at his desk, his pencils and sketches scattered. But he wasn't drawing, he was writing a card for their anniversary, which was a week away. He chose a simple card with a picture of a maple tree, like the one they had planted together, and he wrote, "Claire, you are my everything. I made mistakes, but I'm learning. Let's build again, one step at a time." He poured his heart into it, hoping she would see his love, but when he gave her the card the next morning, she smiled. But her smile was guarded, and she said, "Thank you, Mike. It's beautiful, but I need time." And he realized that forgiveness wasn't a moment, but a process, and that the scars from his suspicions still hurt. But he was willing to wait, willing to change, because she was worth it. 3 months later, in a park by Lake Michigan, where the waves lapped gently against the shore and the autumn sun glinted off the water, Claire and Michael walked side by side, their hands clasped but not as tightly as before, as if both were afraid to squeeze too tightly for fear of ruining the fragile balance they had begun to build. They had gone away for the weekend to a small cottage by the lake, away from the city, away from work, away from the memories of the night their marriage had nearly failed. Sitting by the fire that evening, they talked not about the watch, not about the journal, but about their fears, about how Claire was afraid of losing herself in her career, and Michael was afraid of losing her. "I thought you were leaving me," he said, staring into the fire, his voice quiet but honest. "And I made it worse because I didn't know how to ask." Claire looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight, and she said, "I was afraid you couldn't see me, the real me. But I never wanted to leave, Mike. I wanted us." She raised her hand, and on her wrist glittered the watch, the one he had found, engraved for a special person, and she had put it on today, for the first time, as a subtle gesture, as a sign that she was ready to move forward, but her eyes were wary, and he knew it was not a complete forgiveness, just a step, a small one, but an important one. They went back to the cottage, to bed, and for the first time in months their embrace was warm, but not without a shadow. The scars remained, and they both knew that the road ahead would be long, full of work and honesty and patience. But sitting there under the stars, with her hand in his, Michael felt that they could do it, that their love, however tattered, was still alive, and Claire, feeling his warmth, thought that maybe they would find their way, not to perfection, but to something real, fragile, but theirs. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.